You finally received the news you had been waiting for. The test came back negative. The position was confirmed. The difficult conversation ended well. The money you needed finally arrived. The relationship that seemed to be falling apart found its way back. It was exactly what you had hoped to hear. You were certain it would change everything once it arrived. You had waited for it, and then it did. It was there, real, confirmed, and something inside you didn't respond the way it was supposed to. The immediate relief that seemed so obvious never came. The joy you imagined would arrive with the news came late, or it arrived smaller than expected, or it faded more quickly than it should have. And hours later, sometimes even days later, your system was still processing something that should have been resolved the moment the word yes, or negative, or everything is fine appeared on the screen. Most people interpret this as some kind of personal flaw, ingratitude, emotional numbness, an inability to be happy, or that persistent feeling that maybe the good news isn't good enough, that there's always one more problem waiting just behind it. But what decades of neuroscience have mapped with increasing precision is that this delay is not a flaw in your personality. It is a structural feature of how the nervous system processes positive information versus negative information. An asymmetry built over millions of years of evolution, one that operates with the same efficiency and the same indifference to the calendar no matter how long the good news was expected, how deeply it was deserved, or how desperately it was needed. Researcher Tiffany Ito from the University of Colorado conducted a series of studies using measurements of the brain's electrical activity to map how the brain responds to emotionally positive and emotionally negative images. What she found was an asymmetry measurable in milliseconds. The neural response to negative stimuli is faster, stronger, and longer lasting than the response to equally intense positive stimuli. Not just subjectively, electrically. In the signal the brain generates before a single conscious thought has even formed about what is being seen. This means that bad news, or a threat, or a source of danger, enters the processing system with automatic priority and greater speed. Good news enters through a slower channel with less physiological urgency and a much quieter signal. The system is not ignoring the good news, it is processing it more slowly and with less intensity because, from the perspective of survival, it represents far less immediate risk. A threat that goes undetected can be fatal. Good news that goes unnoticed simply means the benefit is not fully experienced. The asymmetry and the cost of those two errors gradually shaped a system that deliberately, though entirely unconsciously, processes the negative with far greater urgency than the positive. But there is a second dimension to this asymmetry that goes beyond processing speed. Physiologist Hans Selye, who devoted decades to studying stress, identified something that remains deeply counterintuitive for most people. The nervous system does not distinguish in its initial biological response between negative change and positive change. It distinguishes between stability and change. Selye described the concept of Eustress, the stress generated by positive events, and demonstrated that, physiologically, major positive events activate many of the same response mechanisms as negative ones. A promotion that brings greater responsibility, moving to a better city, the birth of a long-awaited and deeply wanted child, the resolution of a problem that had kept the system on high alert for months. Each of these changes, as positive as they are, requires the system to reorganize what it had come to expect. And regulatory systems, by design, need time to recalibrate after any significant change, even when that change is unquestionably good. This explains something many people experience, but rarely know how to describe. The exhaustion that follows major good news. The deep sleep that comes after a long period of tension finally ends. The difficulty of fully entering a celebration when it takes place immediately after the stressful event that is now being celebrated. A system that has spent weeks or months in a state of mobilization does not instantly shift into rest the moment the reason for that mobilization disappears. It has to move through a process of recalibration, a process with its own timing, its own curve, one that does not obey the simple logic that says, the problem is over, therefore the stress should be over too. And there is something even more specific hidden within this pattern, something that is not about processing speed or post-stress recalibration, but about the way the nervous system ultimately decides that something is truly safe. A way of deciding that demands far more evidence for safety than it ever demands for danger. And that explains why a single piece of good news, no matter how clear or undeniable it may be, is often not enough for the system to finally register that the danger has truly passed. In 2001, psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues published a comprehensive review of the scientific literature on how human beings process positive and negative events across virtually every domain of life. The title captured the central finding with remarkable clarity. Bad is stronger than good. The bad is stronger than the good. What the review documented was not simply that negative events hurt more. It showed that the asymmetry is systematic, consistent, and appears across completely different areas of human experience. Relationships, negative behaviors from a partner have a proportionally greater impact on relationship satisfaction than equally positive behaviors. Learning, negative feedback produces faster and more lasting behavioral adjustments than equally positive feedback. Health, the anxiety generated by a potentially serious diagnosis lingers far longer than the relief produced by a clearly positive medical result. Finances. The pain of losing a specific amount of money is felt more intensely and lasts longer than the pleasure of gaining the exact same amount. And, especially relevant to what we're exploring here, memory. Negative experiences are remembered with greater detail, greater vividness, and for much longer than equally intense positive experiences. Baumeister proposed that this asymmetry is not a cognitive flaw or a bias that needs to be corrected. It is the expected behavior of a system that evolved in an environment where underestimating a threat often carried irreversible consequences, while underestimating an opportunity simply meant missing out on a potential benefit. The difference between those two kinds of mistakes gradually shaped a system that gives far more attention to the negative than to the positive. But what this asymmetry creates, specifically when someone receives good news after a prolonged period of worry, is an experience many people describe as deeply disorienting. The good news arrives, the rational problem has been solved, and the body, strangely, seems never to have received the memo. Neuroscientist Antoine Bechara at the University of Southern California spent years studying how the body responds at the somatic level to situations of danger and safety. His research showed that the body's response to negative stimuli, changes in skin conductance, shifts in heart rate, muscular tension, is faster, stronger, and much slower to fade than its response to equally significant positive stimuli. In practical terms, the body learns the signal of danger quickly and holds on to it. It learns the signal of safety much more slowly and lets go of it far more easily. That is why someone who has spent weeks waiting for medical test results can receive a completely negative report, with no indication of illness whatsoever, and still experience, for days afterward, a lingering tightness in the chest, difficulty sleeping deeply, or the persistent feeling that they are still waiting for something to happen. Not because they doubt the result, because over those previous weeks, the body learned to carry a particular level of activation, and that level does not disappear the moment the rational facts change. It dissolves gradually, through time and through repeated experiences in which the anticipated threat simply never materializes. There is another finding, documented by Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, about how people anticipate their own emotional reactions to future events, one that is directly relevant to this delay. Gilbert spent years studying what he called affective forecasting, the human ability to predict how we will feel in response to future events. What he discovered was that people are systematically inaccurate in these predictions, in ways that are both specific and remarkably predictable. For negative events, people tend to overestimate both the intensity and the duration of the suffering they will experience. For positive events, they also tend to overestimate both the intensity and the duration of the happiness they expect to feel. This creates a very particular situation when good news finally arrives. A person may have spent weeks imagining exactly how they would feel when that moment finally came, with a specific emotional intensity and a specific sense of relief. And when the real experience does not match the imagined version, the gap between expectation and reality can, paradoxically, produce a sense of disappointment or unfamiliarity inside what was supposed to be a joyful moment. Was the good news somehow not good enough? Or was the prediction calibrated for an emotional intensity that the real nervous system simply does not produce that quickly? Think about how this unfolds in everyday life. Someone spends months anxiously waiting for the results of an important application. They vividly imagine the moment they will finally see the outcome. Then the word accepted appears, and instead of overwhelming joy, they simply stare at the screen thinking, is that it? Not because it didn't matter, because the nervous system processes good news in a way that is structurally slower and less intense than anticipation had suggested. Or someone spends months in conflict with a person they deeply care about. Eventually, the conversation that resolves everything finally happens. Things genuinely improve. And yet, over the following days, a thread of tension remains. The system continues scanning that relationship for signs of trouble. It still struggles to fully trust that everything has truly been resolved. Or someone's financial situation objectively improves. The debts have been paid. Income has stabilized. And yet, for weeks or even months afterward, the system continues generating anxiety around money. They still wake up at 3 a.m. mentally running calculations that no longer need to be made. In every one of these situations, the system is not being irrational. It is remaining faithful to its own processing logic, a logic that demands far more evidence before confirming safety than it ever requires to confirm danger. If you've ever experienced that very specific feeling, that the good news arrived, but the relief somehow didn't, this channel exists to put words to experiences exactly like that. Subscribe so the next video is already waiting for you. But while asymmetrical processing and the body's slow recalibration explain the initial delay, they still do not fully explain why some people continue struggling to actually feel the good news even days or weeks later. Why the system seems to require far more than objective facts before updating its internal judgment that everything is truly okay. The answer lies in how the nervous system learns safety, and hidden within that learning is a principle that completely changes our expectations about how long this process actually takes. The nervous system does not learn safety in the same way it learns threat. To learn that something is dangerous, a single experience is often enough. A burn from a hot surface, an unexpected betrayal, an event that links a specific context with pain, danger, or loss. The system registers it, consolidates it, and preserves that association with remarkable efficiency. But learning that something which was once dangerous is no longer a threat, or that a context which once felt unsafe is now safe, is fundamentally different. It is slower, it demands more evidence, and structurally, it depends on repetition rather than intensity. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, whose work on the brain's fear circuits became foundational in the neuroscience of emotion, described this process with remarkable precision. When the nervous system learns that something previously associated with danger no longer represents a threat, that learning does not erase the original memory. Instead, it creates a new memory. A memory that essentially says, this signal, in this context, no longer needs to be treated as danger. Ledoux called this process extinction, and what his research demonstrated is that extinction requires repetition, not a single experience where everything turned out fine, but multiple experiences over time in which the signal that was once associated with danger appears, and the danger never materializes. Each experience without the feared outcome adds another thin layer of evidence to the new memory, and the new memory only begins to compete with the original one once it has accumulated enough evidence to carry comparable weight. Now translate that into the experience of receiving good news after a long period of intense worry. The good news is a fact, a real, verifiable piece of information that the prefrontal cortex registers and understands. But the amygdala, the system responsible for maintaining the threat response, does not update its assessment based on a single fact. It updates based on patterns. Based on repeated experiences confirming that the signal of safety is trustworthy. That is why the resolution of a difficult situation so often fails to produce immediate relief. Real relief, the kind you actually feel in your body, in your breathing, in the quality of your sleep, arrives only after the system has accumulated enough experiences showing that the threat has truly passed. When the negative medical result is confirmed again at the follow-up appointment. When the conflict that seemed resolved remains resolved for enough days. When financial stability continues long enough that the system finally stops waiting for the next crisis. Not because the person is naturally suspicious or pessimistic, but because the system responsible for evaluating safety was built to require robust evidence before changing its position. And in this context, robust evidence means repeated patterns, not isolated events. There is a concept that helps explain why this asymmetry is so pronounced. The threshold for confirming threat is low. A single ambiguous signal, interpreted as potentially dangerous, is enough to activate the alarm system. The threshold for confirming safety is high. Multiple consistent experiences, sustained over enough time, are required before the system truly registers that it can let its guard down. It is as though the nervous system uses two different sets of weights on the same scale. On the side of danger, a single feather is enough to tip the balance. On the side of safety, substantial weight has to accumulate before the scale finally begins to move. Think about what this creates in real life. Someone who spent months monitoring a health condition. The test results gradually improved. The doctor is pleased with the progress. Objectively, the situation is much better, and yet that person still wakes up thinking about the illness. Still checks the same symptoms they were told no longer require concern. Still feels a tightness in the chest whenever the subject comes up in conversation. Not because they don't believe the medical results, but because the system that learned to monitor that threat has not yet accumulated enough evidence to conclude that the monitoring can finally stop. Or someone whose relationship went through a prolonged period of mistrust, distance, and conflict. Even after things have genuinely improved, they still carry a quiet vigilance in the background. They continue listening closely to their partner's tone of voice. They still interpret brief moments of silence as potential signs that something bigger is wrong. Not because the relationship has not improved, but because the system that learned to monitor that relationship for signs of danger is still operating in surveillance mode, waiting for enough evidence that it can safely reduce the frequency of its scanning. Or the professional who lived through a period of instability at work. Layoffs seemed possible, projects were cancelled. The future felt uncertain. Even after their position has been secured and officially confirmed, they continue feeling a persistent undercurrent of anxiety about work. They keep delivering everything with excessive caution long after that level of vigilance is no longer necessary. They continue watching their manager's body language during meetings, searching for signs of dissatisfaction that are no longer there. This pattern is not irrational. It is a system responding exactly as it learned to respond to a particular environment, and now requiring enough time inside a different environment before it updates what it considers normal. But there is one final layer to this story that goes beyond fear circuits and confirmation thresholds. Because there are situations where a person receives good news, the nervous system gradually processes it, the body begins to relax, and yet the news still doesn't feel completely real, not because of anxiety, because of something else. A feeling that what happened has not yet fully found its place within the story the person tells about who they are, as though the positive event has not yet been woven into their personal narrative. And until it does, it remains an external fact, real, verifiable, and undeniably true, yet somehow still outside of them. Psychologist Dan McAdams of Northwestern University spent decades studying something that most theories of memory and emotion treated as secondary: the way people organize their experiences into narratives. What McAdams documented is that human beings do not simply live experiences, they build them into stories. Every person carries, partly consciously and partly automatically, a narrative about who they are, where they came from, and where they are going. A narrative with characters, recurring themes, and patterns that repeat themselves. A narrative with its own internal logic about the kinds of things that tend to happen to someone like them. And new events, including good news, do not automatically become part of that narrative simply because they happened. They have to be integrated. They have to find where they belong within the story that already exists. They have to be reconciled with what the system believes to be true about how life works for that particular person. For someone whose internal narrative has been shaped over years around struggle, uncertainty, hardship, or repeated disappointment, good news does not fit into that narrative easily. Not because they do not want it to be real, but because, at least for now, it does not belong in the story their system tells about who they are. It is like inserting a chapter with an entirely different tone into a novel whose narrative arc has been heading in another direction. The chapter is real, but it takes time for the story to absorb it and continue from there. instead of treating it as an anomaly. That is why some people, even when faced with a genuine achievement or a truly positive outcome, struggle to simply accept that this is now part of their reality, that they deserve it, that it is sustainable, that it will not suddenly be taken away. The good news has to be integrated into the narrative of identity, and that integration follows its own timeline, one that does not obey the calendar of when the event actually occurred. But there is something that significantly speeds up this process, something that is rarely mentioned in conversations about emotional processing. Researcher James Cone of the University of Virginia developed what he called social baseline theory. Its central idea is that the human brain was not optimized to process information alone. It was optimized to process information within a social context, with the real or implied presence of other members of the group. The presence of another regulated person is not merely comforting. It literally changes how the nervous system processes the very same information. What Cone's studies demonstrated, quite concretely, is that holding the hand of someone you trust during an aversive experience measurably reduces the brain's threat response in neuroimaging studies, not as a placebo effect, as a genuine change in the way the nervous system processes the stimulus. And the same principle works in the opposite direction. Good news that is shared with someone, not simply communicated, but genuinely shared with another person who receives it with real presence, is processed differently by the nervous system than good news experienced entirely in isolation. The presence of another regulated and emotionally available nervous system acts as an amplifier for the signal of safety. This is real. This is good. You can settle into this. Not through words, through direct physiological resonance. Researcher Paul Zak of Claremont Graduate University, who extensively studied the neurobiology of trust and social connection, documented how oxytocin, the neuropeptide associated with bonding and trust, facilitates the processing of positive information and the consolidation of states of safety. Oxytocin is not simply the hugging hormone. It is part of the mechanism through which the nervous system registers that the environment is safe enough to relax its vigilance, and its levels are directly influenced by the quality of social presence, by genuine attention, meaningful contact, and the feeling of being seen, and of knowing that what you are experiencing truly matters to someone else. This has a very practical implication for the delay explored throughout this entire video. Good news needs to be shared, truly shared, with presence, with someone who genuinely receives it, for the nervous system to process it with the same depth that it processes threats on its own. Not as emotional venting, not as the communication of information, but as a shared experience, as one nervous system finding, in another nervous system, the resonance that quietly confirms, this is real, and it is safe to let it in. When all of these pieces are brought together, what emerges is a much more precise description of what it means for good news to truly land. It is not the moment when it is understood cognitively. It is the moment when the nervous system has accumulated enough evidence through repeated experiences without threat, through integration into the narrative of identity, and through being shared in the presence of another, to begin updating its assessment that the environment has genuinely changed. That takes time, and the amount of time it takes does not reflect how important the news was. It reflects how much evidence the system needed before it could trust that it was safe to change its position. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel, because every video adds another piece to this map of how the nervous system really works, and the next one takes the journey even deeper. The asymmetry in the speed and intensity with which the brain processes negative versus positive stimuli, documented by Tiffany Ito at the University of Colorado through measurements of electrical brain activity, shows that the nervous system responds to negative stimuli both faster and more intensely than it does to equally positive stimuli. Not as a cognitive distortion, but as a structural feature of a system optimized to prioritize the detection of threats. The concepts of Eustress and the general adaptation syndrome, developed by Hans Selye, demonstrate that the nervous system responds to any significant change, whether positive or negative, with a recalibration process that unfolds according to its own timeline, regardless of the emotional valence of the change. A system that has spent months in a state of mobilization does not immediately return to rest when the reason for that mobilization disappears. It moves through a recalibration process that does not follow rational expectations. Roy Baumeister and colleagues' comprehensive review, Bad is Stronger Than Good, demonstrates that negative events, information, and experiences exert a disproportionately greater impact than equivalent positive events across virtually every domain of human psychology, from memory and relationships to learning and overall well-being. Antoine Bechara's research on asymmetric bodily responses shows that the body's reaction to negative stimuli is faster, stronger, and slower to fade than its response to equivalent positive stimuli. The body learns the signal of threat quickly and retains it, while learning the signal of safety more slowly and releasing it more easily. Daniel Gilbert's work on affective forecasting at Harvard University documents that people consistently overestimate both the intensity and the duration of the emotions they expect to experience in response to future events, creating expectations of happiness that the real nervous system, with its structural asymmetry, often cannot match in either speed or intensity. The process of extinction, described by Joseph Ledoux through decades of research on fear circuits, shows that learning safety does not erase a threat memory. Instead, it creates a new memory that requires repetition and time to accumulate enough evidence, establishing what we have described here as an asymmetric confirmation threshold, in which the nervous system demands far more evidence to confirm safety than it does to confirm danger. Narrative identity theory, developed by Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, shows that new events, including good news, must be integrated into the story the system carries about who a person is and how life works for them. Until that integration occurs, the good news remains an externally verifiable fact that has not yet fully landed in the person's inner experience. James Cone's social baseline theory at the University of Virginia demonstrates that the human nervous system evolved to process information in a social context, and that the presence of another regulated and emotionally available nervous system measurably changes how the brain processes the very same information, including positive news. Paul Zach's research on oxytocin at Claremont Graduate University further shows that the neuropeptide associated with trust and social bonding facilitates both the processing of positive information and the consolidation of states of safety, and that its levels are directly influenced by the quality of the social presence with whom an experience is shared. If any part of this video describes something you have experienced, that strange feeling of receiving good news while the relief arrives much later, leave a comment. Just one word. What stayed with you? Because recognizing that this delay is not ingratitude, emotional numbness, or an inability to experience happiness is the beginning of a different relationship with the way your own system processes positive experiences. And there is a direct connection between everything we explored here and something this channel has already examined in depth. Perhaps the most important mechanism of all behind why good news takes so long to truly land. Because the delay we explored in this video, that gap between receiving the information and actually feeling its impact, is, at its core, the other side of a much broader pattern. A nervous system that requires more evidence to confirm safety than it does to confirm danger does not develop that asymmetry by accident. It develops it in response to something, to a long enough period in which remaining on alert was the correct response to the environment, to real experiences that calibrated the system to monitor more carefully than it trusts. That entire process, how the nervous system continues living inside a difficult moment from the past long after it has ended, was explored in one of the most watched videos on this channel. The mechanism through which situations that have already been resolved continue to be relived, why chronological time and emotional processing do not move at the same pace, and why today's good news must compete inside the nervous system with memories that were consolidated far more powerfully than any recent positive event can overcome. That is the video that completes the map we have built here. Your brain is still living in that difficult moment, and understanding why, with the same scientific precision that guides every video on this channel, is what gradually makes it possible to begin living in this moment as well.